Hi, my name's Ollie, and in this Politics Explained video, I'm going to go through everything you need to know about comparing the policies of the Republicans and Democrats, the coalitions of voters for each party, and the party system in EdXL A-level politics. I'm going to start by looking at the parts of the specification this video covers, as well as some key questions you could get on this in the exam. I'm then going to start by looking at comparing the policies of the Republicans and the Democrats, looking at key areas of similarity and difference, before going into the party system, and importantly, why the two-party system is so dominant, before finally looking at the coalition of supporters for each party, looking at race, gender, religion, age, education, and geography. The PDF you can see on your screen is part of an updated online textbook in relation to US politics for the EdXL A-level government politics course that you can purchase on the Politics Explained website, where you can also purchase loads of other resources to help you in your politics A-level, including detailed essay plans, updated textbooks, and everything you need to know guides for different parts of the course, and a place to sign up for tutoring if you're interested. But yeah, starting off with the parts of the specification this video covers. So this is in the US democracy and participation part of the course, and it's the sixth of 7 videos. It's going to finish off the videos on the channel on the US side of the course. Effectively, there's been 2 previous videos, one on the Democratic Party and one on the Republican Party, so make sure to look at those first. This one's going to look at the coalition of supporters for each party, and also going to have a look at comparing the parties. So that's one thing you could get asked in the exam, whilst we're also going to have a quick look at the party system and the two-party system, not because it's necessarily going to cover the 30 marker, and not necessarily because it's actually mentioned specifically in the specification, just because I think there's still a chance it could definitely come up in some of the 12 markers when comparing it to the UK, so it's definitely worth knowing. In terms of the potential essay questions you can get asked, as I said, in terms of the 12 marker, you could get one kind of comparing the party systems in the UK and the USA. And you can also, this will also be helpful for looking at the kind of differences in policies between the parties in the different countries, and potentially you could get one in relation to kind of the groups of voters for each party. Though I'd say that's a little bit less likely. That could definitely come up in the exam. In terms of 30 markers, this one will be useful in particular for kind of a question that compares the policies of the Republican and the Democratic parties. You could also get one on kind of the factors influencing voting behaviour, looking at race, and that's in the final part of the video. We're going to look at the coalitions of different parties, and so you can look at race, gender, and make about a couple of these different factors. And as with all of the US content, in the exam, unfortunately, it's quite difficult because with the 30 markers, there can be quite a few cross-cutting questions between different topics. So this content may be useful for other types of questions that could come up. Yeah, starting off by comparing the policies of the Republicans and Democrats, and first looking at key areas of similarity. And the first key area of similarity is foreign policy. And this can be seen as a key area of agreement between the Democrats and Republicans, largely driven by geopolitical necessities and historical commitments and alliances rather than domestic ideology. Both parties have demonstrated a commitment to funding national security and defence effectively, recognising the importance of maintaining the US's global leadership, responding to international challenges, and protecting the US population. This consensus can be seen in their bipartisan support for Ukraine, where both parties acknowledge the strategic importance of supporting a democratic ally against Russian aggression. Similarly, when it comes to China, Democrats and Republicans share a tough stance, underscoring the need to address economic and security challenges posed by Beijing's rising global influence. And you can see that in both adopting protectionist policies. So that was actually one where Trump kind of went first, and the Democrats actually fell behind, and now Biden supporting very similar policies. Both parties have also consistently shown strong support for Israel, recognizing its strategic importance and the US's long-standing support. On the other hand, as a quick counterpoint, that Trump is very different in terms of style and in some areas in substance. So Trump's approach to foreign policy marks a significant departure from the traditional American diplomatic practices, with a more unilateral, confrontational and nationalistic stance. It's evident in his decisions to withdraw from international agreements such as JCPOA and the Paris Climate Agreement. And that is potentially a key area of disagreement between the Democrats and Republicans. Additionally, Trump's foreign policy exhibited a reluctance to use the US military to defend allies, particularly in Europe, and he frequently pressured NATO members to increase their defence spending. And this differed significantly from both the Republican and Democratic establishments, and has continued following his presidency. as he's called for the US to limit military support it gives to Ukraine in 2024. So there's some overall broad agreement in terms of foreign policy, but still some differences with Trump in terms of style and in some areas in terms of substance as well. It can be argued there's also a lot of similarity in terms of their broad approaches to economic policy. So both parties operate within a fundamentally capitalist framework, and neither party advocates for major structural changes to the economy, opting instead for adjustments within the existing capitalist system. There are a few supporters within either party for big changes, such as nationalising healthcare or seriously tackling inequality, which is perhaps partly influenced by the influence of rich individuals and businesses in politics through campaign financing and interest groups. Additionally, recent developments have seen both parties aligning more closely on trade policy. So Biden has continued many of the broadly protectionist policies initiated by Trump, particularly in response to the rise of China. This alignment reflects a shared interest in protecting and promoting US industry against competitive pressures from abroad, moving away from the kind of previous agreement between the parties on free trade in the 1990s and 2000s. This can be seen as being driven by the changing world economy and the fact that China is rising and clearly seeking to use its economic power to have influence over other countries and challenge the US's dominance, and the US has to respond. There's not really many party divisions over that because they fundamentally agree that the US has a similar interest. Furthermore, both parties have demonstrated the ability to unite in response to significant events, as illustrated in their support for the CARES Act during the COVID-19 pandemic. So that's where you see that in relation to kind of responding to crises in terms of economic policy, there's often agreement on what needs to be done. And you saw that in response to the 2008 financial crisis, as well as COVID-19. That sometimes you do need to spend a lot of money to kind of rescue the economy. So they're the similarities. What we're going to have a look at is key areas of policy difference. Look at the previous videos on the Republican and Democratic parties for much more detail on these, which we've already looked at. This is going to kind of summarize the key agreements, the key disagreements. On social issues, Democrats advocate for progressive social and moral issues, emphasizing racial equality, reproductive rights, LGBT rights, and criminal justice reform. So they've supported kind of civil rights through movements like Black Lives Matter, defending Roe v. Wade, and played a significant role in legalizing same-sex marriage. This contrasts significantly with conservatives, who uphold individual responsibility and Christian values, opposing affirmative action, more supporting restrictive abortion laws, and are historically conservative on LGBTQ+ rights. They emphasise law and order and advocate for tough sentencing laws, the death penalty, and strong support for the Second Amendment. Whereas Democrats' approach to crime includes reforms like eliminating cash bail and decriminalising marijuana, whilst also promoting gun control. In terms of immigration, Democrats generally support a more humane approach to immigration, advocating for comprehensive reforms that include pathway to citizenship for undocumented immigrants. They tend to oppose very strict border enforcement measures aiming for policies that protect human rights and family unity. Though this being said, they by no means are strongly supportive of immigration. Republicans are far stricter, advocating for really strict immigration policies, including increased border security and enforcement. Can be seen as Trump's policy, where we have supported a border wall, focused on upholding national sovereignty and security, and emphasising the need for stringent immigration enforcement and building a border wall, as I mentioned. In terms of climate change, Democrats have a strong focus on climate change, advocating for comprehensive action. They support issues like Obama's Clean Power Plan and the Green New Deal, aiming for significant reductions in carbon emissions and a shift towards renewable energy. And the Inflation Reduction Act reflects their commitment to combating climate change. On the Republican side, some moderates acknowledge climate change and support measured policies, but as a whole, the Republicans are more resistant to comprehensive climate action. The Trump administration rolled back many environmental regulations introduced by Obama and withdrew from the Paris Climate Agreement, really prioritising economic growth, kind of ignoring in a lot of ways climate change. On healthcare, the Democrats strongly advocate for expanded government involvement in healthcare, with key achievements like the Affordable Care Act aimed at increasing healthcare access. Some progressives within the party also push for more radical changes, such as Medicare for all. On the other hand, the Republicans emphasise market-based solutions and limited government involvement in healthcare, so supporting privatised healthcare. They oppose the Affordable Care Act, advocating for competition and consumer choice instead. In terms of government intervention in the economy, the Democrats support a significant role for the government in the economy, advocating for interventions to address market failures and reduce economic inequality. At least, well, I say significant, definitely much more significant than Republicans, who advocate for restricted government intervention, emphasizing the importance of free market capitalism and free market principles in driving economic growth. Can be seen in their support for the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. They really support and also support for deregulation under Trump. On economic inequality and welfare, the Republicans acknowledge the need for social welfare programs, but emphasize personal responsibility and limited government involvement. So they advocate for reforms to ensure the sustainability of Social Security and Medicare, often proposing stricter eligibility criteria for welfare programs, and are critical of expansions in welfare. By contrast, the Democrats prioritize kind of addressing economic inequality and having a strong social safety net through Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and the expanded child tax credit. So they support policies aimed at reducing poverty, providing healthcare, and ensuring financial security for the elderly, at least to much more of an extent than Republicans. Also, that must be looked at in terms of differences. So we've looked at in terms of policy, but I think what you've seen in the last, well, since the rise of Trump effectively, is a massively increased difference in terms of style and attitudes to democracy. So the increasing polarization and partisanship in US politics, particularly in recent years, can largely be attributed to differences in style and attitude towards democracy, rather than necessarily there being a widening gap in policy positions compared to the gap there used to be. So Democratic and Republican parties have policy differences, but this is arguably no more prominent than has always been the case. Whilst there have always been notable areas of convergence recently, there's also been these notable areas of convergence, especially in foreign and trade policy, as I looked through. Both parties have shown a general agreement on the need to project American power globally, and recently there's been surprising alignment in trade policy, particularly kind of protectionism in response to China. Where there's a key difference, though, and you see this as kind of really contributing to the polarization in US politics, is in style. So the key divergence has been about style and, crucially, their approach to democratic norms. Trump's presidency marks a significant shift in style with his populist approach that often flouted democratic conventions and showed a disregard for the political establishment. His rhetoric about draining the swamp and his direct, often personal attacks on politicians from both parties, including derogatory nicknames, exemplified a kind of confrontational and very different, divisive political style. Furthermore, the events surrounding January 6th, the insurrection, and the denial of the 2020 election results by Trump and his supporters highlighted a willingness to prioritize personal and partisan interests over democratic principles and a real lack of respect for democracy in the US. In contrast, Biden and the majority of the Democratic Party represent a continuation of traditional US democratic politics and the style of the political establishment. They've strongly criticised Trump's populist style, presenting it as a fundamental threat to the norms and values of American democracy. And this difference in approach and respect for democratic institutions and norms has become a defining characteristic of the current political landscape, overshadowing policy differences to an extent and highlighting the critical role of political culture and leadership style in shaping public discourse and partisanship in the US. So it's kind of this attitude to democracy and different style that is really important to the increasing partisanship. There's always been policy differences, and those remain most definitely. But it's arguably not the policy differences that have increased in relation to the increasing partisanship and polarization in US politics. It's the differences in style and attitude to democracy. That's a bit, I suppose that you don't necessarily have to agree with it. That's mainly my view anyway. What you've also seen within the parties is increasing ideological convergence within each party. So in recent years, there's been a notable trend towards increasing unity and ideological convergence, particularly within the Republican Party, so with a bit of a move away from broad churches. So the Republican Party in particular has shifted to align with the populist and nationalist platform championed by Trump, and this realignment has led to a reduction in the number of moderates within the party, as primaries increasingly favour candidates who adhere strictly to the Trumpian line. Whilst more moderate members of the Congress within the Democratic Party have also been increasingly criticised, and fewer in number due to increased polarisation. Again, primaries and decreased appetite for cooperating with the Republicans when they're under Trump. And this has contributed to a growing sense of dissatisfaction among the broader US public. Many Americans find themselves alienated by the lack of moderate options and the intensifying partisan divide, as well as the poor choice of party leaders. This is reflected in polling data, with around 23% of the electorate viewing both Trump and Biden as poor candidates and feeling unrepresented by either option in the 2024 election. Okay, so that's a quick kind of thing comparing kind of the policies of the main parties and look at some key kind of evaluative points. What we're going to have a look at now, before we look at the coalitions of these parties, just quickly look at the party system. As I note here, this is unlikely to come up in the 30 marker and isn't really a point on the spec, but it may be necessary to know for 12 markers, and it could definitely come up in a 12 marker. So I thought we'd quickly have and it's also just useful to know in terms of US politics and have a bit of a broader understanding. So firstly, what we'll have a look at is influences in US politics apart from the two main parties. So the Libertarian Party, founded in 1971, is anchored in the principles of classical liberalism, advocating for minimal government intervention in both economic and personal matters. Its key beliefs centre around individual liberty, free market capitalism, and non-interventionist foreign policy, as well as limited government. Policy goals of the party really focus on reducing government spending and taxes, deregulation, and the protection of individual rights and privacy. And it's historically, though, struggled to translate its ideology into electoral success, particularly in winning seats in Congress. Though they've had a few members of Congress, none of these have won a seat when standing as a Libertarian candidate. Instead, they've switched from the Republican Party once being elected. The impact has largely been confined to influencing political discourse rather than direct policy implementation, and candidates such as Ron Paul and Gary Johnson have been instrumental in raising awareness about libertarian ideals. So Gary Johnson, as the Libertarian Party's candidate in 2012 and 2016, brought attention to the party's stance on drug legalization and civil liberties, leading to kind of discussions in mainstream politics about the issues. Though they have key allies in the fiscal conservatives of the Republican Party, US government policy has increasingly moved away from their goals, with spiralling government debt and major spending after the 2008 financial crisis and COVID-19 in particular. Another important, I suppose neither of these are that important, to be honest, but like the two most prominent kind of third parties are the Libertarians and the Green Party. And the Green Party was founded in 2001 as a formal national party rooted in environmentalism and social justice, and its goals focus on implementing comprehensive environmental protections, promoting renewable energy, universal healthcare, and advocating for electoral reforms like ranked choice voting. So quite similar to the Green Party in the UK, actually. Despite its strong ideological base, it's faced, again, as with the Libertarian Party, challenges in translating its values into significant electoral success at the federal level. It's not had a member elected to Congress and generally receives a small percentage of the vote in presidential elections. So in 2020, it received just 0.3% of the vote, It has achieved some minor success in local and state elections, though, and it has around 100 officials across the United States, which really is not that many, considering the really significant number of elected officials in US politics due to federalism. The impact of the Green Party has been more pronounced in influencing the national dialogue on environmental and social justice issues. Notable candidates like Ralph Nader, who ran for president in 2000 and received 2.74% of the vote, brought attention to the corporate influence in politics and environmental concerns, pushing these topics higher up in political decisions and the agenda, and influencing the increased importance of climate change within the Democratic Party. Overall, however, the US political landscape, dominated by the two-party system, has largely limited their influence on government policy, as with the Libertarian Party. What's worth also having a look at in terms of the third parties is presidential candidates. So a third-party presidential candidate has never won the presidency, and very few have ever received any electoral college votes. However, they can have an influence in shifting the policy discourse and influencing the policies of the two main candidates. In 1968, third-party candidate George Wallace, running for the American Independent Party, won 46 electoral college votes and 13.5% of the vote by appealing to racist segregationist sentiment in the southern states, with the campaign influencing the Republicans to later pursue the southern strategy. In 1992, Ross Perot, running as an independent, probably the most successful in history, won 18.9% of the vote, focusing on fiscal responsibility and trade issues, which pushed Bill Clinton, again, to pay greater attention to balancing the federal budget and be a bit more centrist with the third way. In 2024, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is running as an independent candidate, criticising the two main parties and advocating for anti-vaccine conspiracies. Though he may benefit from the dissatisfaction with the two main candidates, the extent of his support is largely yet to be seen, though increasingly it's looking to be kind of a bit more significant than the third party candidate has ever been in the last two elections, and potentially actually while he was first kind of seen as threatening the Democrats, he's increasingly starting to be seen as more threatening the Republican vote and Trump's vote in particular. But in 2020, the two main parties were so dominant, with the highest vote share of any third-party candidate being 1.2%. So that really shows it's very much a two-party system. In terms of other influences, there are also independent members of Congress. So independent candidates, though rare, have periodically held seats and exerted significant influence, particularly when Congress, and especially the Senate, is closely contested. Historically, the number of independents in Congress has been quite low, with usually one or two at a given time. But these independents can hold the balance of power, making their support crucial for passing legislation. Bernie Sanders is an independent from Vermont who's wielded significant influence in Congress, particularly in shaping the Democratic Party's policy agenda towards more kind of progressive stances, and he does caucus with the Democrats a lot and not very often votes with them. His advocacy for universal healthcare led to widespread support for Medicare for all, significantly shifting the healthcare debate in the US, so that kind of widespread support from young people in particular. And his two presidential campaigns in 2016 and 2020 popularized issues like a $15 minimum wage and tuition-free college. Senator Angus King is an independent from Maine. He's been a significant force in Congress, often serving as a bridge between Democrats and Republicans. A prime example of his vote in favour of the Affordable Care Act repeal efforts, where his opposition was crucial in preserving the ACA during several close votes in 2017. So the Republicans were trying to repeal it, and he voted against it. Additionally, King has played a significant role in the passage of the bipartisan infrastructure framework, and his involvement in bipartisan negotiations to eventual support helped secure its passage. These instances exemplify how King's centrist stance and willingness to collaborate across party lines have made him an influential figure in shaping and determining the outcomes of significant legislative actions. Overall, however, the two-party system is dominant, with Democratic and Republican parties holding nearly all of the power in the US political system. The two parties account for over 98% of the members of the 118th Congress. Even independent members of Congress, such as Sanders and King, choose to caucus with one of the two main parties, highlighting the necessity of aligning with these dominant forces to have any meaningful impact. In the 2020 presidential election, the combined vote share of the Democratic and Republican candidates exceeded 98%, leaving less than 2% for third-party or independent candidates. Third parties have minimal visibility and influence in the broader political landscape. And even political figures who seek to disrupt the two-party system and really change the policies of one of the main parties and offer something new, they're forced to do it through the existing two-party framework rather than outside of it. This is evidenced by Trump and Bernie Sanders, both of whom, despite offering a new approach to politics and really challenging the traditional establishment, had to kind of use the structures and processes, the primary processes of the major parties to gain any national prominence and affect change. We'll quickly have a look at is why is the two-party system so dominant? First key reason is the electoral system. So particularly the first past the post and electoral college heavily favour a two-party setup. In this system, the candidate with the most votes in a constituency wins, which naturally discourages voting for third-party candidates who are less likely to win. The electoral college used in presidential elections further reinforces this by requiring a majority of electoral votes to win, a threshold more easily achieved by one of the two main parties. This creates a structural disadvantage for third-party candidates and makes it incredibly challenging for them to secure enough electoral votes to compete effectively. Crucially, in their extreme polarization, it makes the job of third-party candidates even more difficult, as voters are more likely to vote strategically. Voters often choose candidates from one of the two major parties, not necessarily because they fully agree with them, but to prevent an opposing party's candidate from winning. And in this extreme polarization, the other party's candidate for each side is being seen as a lot more dangerous. And voters are therefore much more likely to vote for the lesser of two evils and kind of driven by fear. And therefore, their vote for a third-party candidate is going to be much less likely because they're going to fear that if they do vote in such a way, it might inadvertently aid the candidate they really don't want to be elected. And this reduces the likelihood of voters voting for third-party candidates and reinforces the dominance of the Democrats and Republicans. It also must be noted that kind of political culture and history in the US is really important. So since the early days of the Republic, American politics has been dominated by two opposing factions, starting with the Federalists and Democratic Republicans and evolving today into the Democrats versus the Republicans. This long-standing tradition has deeply ingrained the notion of a binary political choice in a national consciousness and shapes the political narrative and voter expectations. And most voters today in the US identify with one of the two major political parties. There's also kind of numerous legal and institutional barriers to third parties that kind of impede their ability to compete with the major parties. So stringent ballot access laws, which vary state by state and often require a high number of signatures in order and other challenging criteria to qualify. And additionally, third-party candidates receive less media coverage and are frequently excluded from major debates, limiting their visibility and ability to reach a wider electorate. These hurdles create an uneven playing field, making it difficult for minor parties to gain traction. Okay, so the final thing we're going to have a look at in this video is the coalition of supporters for each party, and looking at a number of different groups of supporters and who they support. Firstly, looking at race. So the majority of non-white Americans are far more likely to support the Democratic Party than the Republican Party. In the 2020 election, 87% of African American voters voted Biden, 61% voted for Biden. Of Hispanic and Latino Americans voted for Biden. There is significant diversity within this demographic, and 63% of Asian Americans voted for Biden, whilst an estimated 58% of white Americans voted for Trump. Key reasons for this correlation are policy and representation. So Democratic policies on social justice, civil rights, and immigration tend to resonate more with minority groups, as does the Democrats' focus on diversity and inclusion. Historical context is really important, particularly for Black Americans, where the shift to the Democratic Party became prominent during the civil rights era, as the party took a strong stance on civil rights. There's also socioeconomic factors, so economic policies and social welfare programs proposed by the Democrats often appeal to minority groups who are statistically more likely to be poor and face social challenges than white Americans. And the Republican Party's approach to issues like immigration and affirmative action has also at times alienated minority groups. There are important nuances and recent changes, though, with a significant generational difference among Black voters. So there's a growing disparity in political support between younger and older Black voters. Whilst older Black voters, who shaped their political views during the civil rights era, tend to strongly support the Democratic Party, younger Black voters are less uniformly aligned. This generational divide reflects younger voters' perspectives on contemporary issues like racial justice, policing, and economic inequality, which might lead to them feel that the Democratic Party doesn't fully address their concerns. And a survey from the Pew Research Center found that while a significant majority of Black voters aged 30 and over identify as or lean Democratic, so 71%, this figure drops to around 60% among Black voters aged 18 to 29. There's also an increasing importance of race in election outcomes. So as non-white Americans become a larger proportion of the population and will become a majority of the US population by the middle of the century, race is becoming more central and increasingly politicized in the US. This demographic shift poses a significant challenge to the Republican Party, which has historically seen lower support from minority groups. And to stay relevant and competitive, Republicans will likely need to adapt their policies and outreach efforts to appeal to a more racially diverse electorate. There's also been a notable shift among Hispanic or Latino voters, with a growing number supporting the Republican Party in certain areas. This is driven by concerns about the economy, apprehensions about socialism, and various cultural issues. So in 2020, Cuban Americans in Florida notably leaned towards the Republican Party, with exit polls suggesting that around 58% of them voted for Trump. This is really important because Florida is a really key swing state with a lot of electoral college votes that the Democrats failed to win in 2020. This was significantly influenced by the Trump campaign's emphasis on anti-socialism, messaging, and economic policies, which resonated strongly with many in the Cuban American community, who were historically wary of socialist regimes due to their personal and familial experiences with Cuba's communist government. Recent elections have also seen a shift among suburban white voters, particularly women, towards the Democratic Party. And this change is influenced by social issues and reactions to the Republican Party's rhetoric and policies. And exit polls indicate that around 55% of suburban women voted for Biden in 2020. In terms of gender, it's not a major determinant of voting behaviour. There is a small yet clear historical gender divide in voting. About 57% of women voted for Biden in the 2020 election, with about 52% of men voting for Trump. Key reasons for this correlation include kind of democratic policies on social issues, healthcare and women's rights, such as supporting abortion rights, which resonate more with female voters. And Republicans have blocked important proposals to promote gender equality, in particular the Equal Rights Amendment. Also, Trump's history of sexual harassment and assault, as well as common sexist language, likely play an important role in putting off female voters. There are important nuances and recent changes, in particular kind of the increasing importance of gender. So the 2022 midterm elections saw the Republican Party lose support from women, particularly due to the party's stance on abortion rights following the overturning of Roe v. Wade. In the 2022 midterm elections, not only did 58% of women vote for the Democratic candidates, there was also a notable increase in women's voter turnout, with women making up about 52% of the electorate. The Republicans, particularly under Trump, remained very popular among young men, which is not mirrored by kind of young women, indicating a growing gender divide under young voters. So 53% of young male voters between 18 and 29 supported Trump, compared to just 37% of young female voters. Religion is also really, really important to voting. So certain religious beliefs significantly influence American voters' political affiliations. So in the 2020 election, white evangelical Christians, who are a really important group within the Republican Party, overwhelmingly supported Trump, with about 6% voting for him. Catholics showed quite a split. 59% of Protestants voted for Trump. Jewish Americans largely supported Biden, and the non-religious supported population largely supported Biden as well by a significant kind of margin. Key reasons are moral and social issues, so Republican policies on issues like abortion and same-sex marriage resonate with conservative groups, particularly the evangelical Christians. Democratic stance on social justice, climate change, and healthcare align more with the values of religiously unaffiliated voters and some Christian denominations. And the historical context is also really, really important, with the Republican Party aligning with evangelical groups since the late 20th century. Under the Trump presidency, Vice President Pence was really important in gaining support from this group, with Trump being a less committed Christian despite what he says. In terms of age, similar to the UK, younger voters are more likely to be left-wing and support the Democrats, whilst older voters are much more likely to be conservative and support the Republican Party. So in 2020, Biden won a significant majority among young voters, so 60% of 18 to 29 results, and Trump won with voters aged 65 plus at 52%. Key reasons for this correlation are that younger voters often prioritise issues like climate change, social justice, and LGBTQ rights, which align more with democratic policies, and also economic concerns. So economic security and low taxation are more critical for older voters, which align more with Republican policies, whilst younger voters favour kind of change and recognise the difficulties with student debt and the job market, and Democrats kind of propose more changes for this, particularly on student debt in the 2020 election with Biden. And then before we look at geography, the final one we're going to have a look at is education. So those with high levels of education are much more likely to vote Democrat than those with lower levels of education. And this is a trend growing in importance in both the UK and the US. And this is a really growing trend. So in 2008, around 50% of voters with a college degree supported Obama, compared to 40% of those without. In 2020, nearly 60% of those with postgraduate education supported Biden, whilst only 41% of those without a college degree did. 67% of white people without a college degree voted for Trump, so a really important correlation. Trump's policies and rhetoric are a key reason for this correlation. So Trump effectively reached out to blue-collar workers, resonating particularly with voters without college degrees. So his messaging on China and kind of America First ideology appealed to their experience of economic change and the impact of globalization. Whilst cultural values are also important, so higher education is often linked with more liberal and progressive values, leading to greater alignment with the Democratic Party. And finally, geography is really important. So cities and urban regions typically lean towards the Democratic Party. So approximately 70% of voters in large urban areas voted Biden, and whilst rural areas strongly support the Republican Party, reflecting significantly different cultures in each area. Suburban areas were historically a mix, but recent trends kind of really quite worrying for the Republican Party. Show that kind of suburban areas, especially those near larger cities, are increasingly leaning Democratic, when in the past they had been a bit stronger stronghold for the Republican Party. Key reasons for this are economic and social diversity, with urban areas more likely to have diverse economies and populations that are more likely to align with Democrats' focus on social justice, environmental concerns, and progressive values. Cultural and economic interests in rural areas are really important. So rural voters whose lifestyles and economic interests may differ significantly from those in urban areas often find greater alignment with Republican policies on issues like agriculture and conservative social values. So Trump's message on trade, immigration, and America First resonated strongly with rural voters who felt seen and heard by his policies and rhetoric. And also, there's an important changing demographics in suburban areas. So the shifting demographics and values in suburban areas, including increased educational attainment and diversity, have led to a gradual shift towards Democratic candidates influenced by issues like healthcare and education. Once considered Republican strongholds, they've become crucial swing areas with both parties vying for these voters. So yeah, that was everything in terms of comparing the parties, looking at the party system and the kind of coalition of supporters for each party. This is the sixth of 7 videos on the US democracy and participation topic, and the 24th of 25 videos to complete the EdXL US government and politics part of the specification in these videos on the channel. So the final ones will be coming out in the next day or two. Let me know if you've got any questions or comments in the comment section below, and I'll get back to you, and I'll see you in that final video.